Welcome everyone to this month's Wellbeing, Health and Youth seminar. I'm Professor Rachel Skinner and I'm the Deputy Director of Wellbeing, Health and Youth, which is an NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in Adolescent Health. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge the funding support of the NHMRC and the wonderful contributions of all of our research partners in the various universities across Australia who partner with us, as you see on the slide. And before we start, we acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd like to draw your attention to our website, whny.org.au. As you can see on the screen, please have a look at it from time to time. And just to note that we've recently got a new section, the Community of Practice section in the site, and it's filled with a lot more resources, publications, achievements of our researchers and many affiliates. And also it has all of the recordings of these webinars if you didn't get a chance to watch them or you'd like to browse through what has been recorded. So we're developing a valuable resource there. So firstly, just a little bit of housekeeping. Your microphone has been muted and your video has been switched off, but you can use the chat function just to communicate between the other listeners, the other audience members. And you can also ask a question of the presenter up at the top. As you can see, there is a different icon for that, but you still type the questions at the bottom of the panel, and that indicates that it's a question for the presenter. Then just to say that after tonight, this is recorded, and so after tonight you will be able to watch the webinar through our website and read the transcript as well. It's also time-stamped if you want to go to specific sections, for example, where a question was asked. So now it's my great honour to introduce Dr. Jennifer Marino. Jen's a Wellbeing, Health and Youth Postdoctoral Fellow and also a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Melbourne and the Royal Women's Hospital. Jennifer conducts both population and clinic-based research in women's health with particular emphasis on sexuality and reproductive health. And her population-based research concerns risk-taking behaviour, in particular in teenagers and young adults. So thank you, Jen, for your time and great knowledge on this topic.
Thank you for having me, and let me just get my screen set up. Oh, I've done this backwards. Sorry. As always, no matter how I'm prepared, by wonderful people, I always sort of get this wrong. Share screen, window, that one, share, and this. Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I also pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or other Indigenous peoples who may be listening today. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Jen Marino, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about changing our approach to risk-taking in adolescence. Speaking of housekeeping, I have a vocal disability that means that my voice is prone to cracking and breaking and sometimes sort of fades in and out a little bit. It doesn't hurt. It's not painful. It doesn't indicate any emotionality on my part, so please don't be alarmed. I find it easier for audiences if I go ahead and actually address that up front, because I've watched people sort of gradually becoming more and more concerned that I was maybe going to get a little worked up. So don't let it stress you out, and maybe my voice will behave itself this time, but maybe not. So
Jen,
we'll see how
just
she
interrupt.
goes.
Are you able
Thank
to
you
put
very
it
much.
on full screen? Presenter sec. Yeah.
Am I? Oh,
No, you're showing me the slide.
am I
You're
showing you
us,
presenter view?
just the
Is it
general
better?
slide view. So.
Oh, that's really an interesting development.
So you might need to put it on presenter mode first and then share. Yeah.
The problem with that is that then I can't actually see the edge thing to share.
Okay.
So let me see if I can work this out. Share screen. Put it on here. Okay. Natasha, can you help? I know you're there somewhere.
I mean, you can just go back to what you had before. That's fine.
Okay.
So, yeah. So we can just see the slides down the side. That's all. But we can still see the.
Okay. And can you see the notes? Please ignore the notes if you see the notes. We'll pretend like I'm deleting this extemporaneously. Oh, good. And now my computer's not actually letting me advance the slides. There we go. So I'm sorry for the presentation, but this is sort of what I'm not sure how to make it work. Well, to begin at the beginning, in 1920, the founder of Yale's School of Public Health, Charles Edward Amory Winslow, defined public health as the art and science of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health through the organized efforts of society. My field, public health epidemiology, is all about measuring and mitigating risk. Preventing disease, prolonging human life, or promoting good health, when we quantitate these, it's in the language of risk. But what is risk? During my training as an epidemiologist, we defined risk as the probability of a negative health event. More recent definitions of risk acknowledge that risk is not restricted to negative outcomes. The mathematics of epidemiology has always been indifferent to the positive or negative character of the event described. Relative and absolute risk are about the probability of the event, not whether it's bad or good for the person experiencing the event. But the language is really just starting to catch up. The more recent of these epidemiologic definitions is more even-handed. Instead of immediately providing an example of a negative outcome, the definition is explicit that the event can be bad or good as long as it's measured in terms of people.
We're still on the first slide. Is that where you're supposed to be?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Fantastic. Nope. Nope, I'm not.
No.
So let's see if we can do this one more time.
Yeah, you could email me. Well, no, sorry, Lena.
I don't think
it takes half an hour for email to come through.
Yeah,
unfortunately. So anyway, now we're on. Yeah, that looks good. Excellent.
Is it
That's
the real thing?
promising.
And is it okay? You're going to have to live with me looking off to this. Well, okay. Let me try one thing and tell me if you see the presenter view or this. Do you see the presenter view or the?
Yeah, the presenter view. Then now we see, okay. But before we were seeing the proper presentation view.
Okay, so
now we see the proper presentation view.
Great. You're just going to have to live with the fact that I'm not looking directly at you.
That's okay.
Okay. Actually, there's one way I might be able to do this. view me in from the side so that I can see my notes. So more recent definitions of risk acknowledge that risk isn't restricted to negative outcomes. Similarly, ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, is the international body that sets the world's voluntary technical standards related to industry and commerce. ISO has defined everything from the standard speeds for photographic film to the requirements for organizations conducting market research to safeguards for access to water during a crisis. The ISO 31000 risk management standard provides common guidelines to manage risks that can be used by any organization and applied to any activity, including decision-making. The standard, which necessarily uses the broadest possible definition, specifies that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. where such effects can be positive, negative, or both, and can address, create, or result in opportunities or threats. So the broadest technical definition of risk now recognizes that risk is about the element of uncertainty, not whether the event produces a positive or negative outcome. There's been a similar evolution away from negative framing in health promotion. Much of health promotion for young people has been designed within a deficit model. In the general case, a deficit approach identifies a problem that needs to be fixed or a need that must be met. In the specific case of risk-taking, the deficit approach says that preventing or reducing specific problem behaviors, health risk behaviors, disrupts a vulnerable person's trajectory to illness, injury, disorder, or other health or social harm. Interventions within the deficit framework are meant to bring a child or adolescent who's missing the mark back to normality. Fixing the person and their behavior will fix the problem. The deficit framework has certain advantages. It makes for easy storytelling to funders and stakeholders, but it fails to take into account the complexity and nuance of human behavior and its context. In education and health promotion, there's been a shift towards asset or strength-based approaches. These refocus from fixing deficiencies to identifying assets available at the individual, family, school, and community levels, including contextual assets. Those assets available to build up the young person and protect them. Strengths, opportunities, and resources offset the negative factors to which a young person is exposed. Positive youth development frameworks take asset models a step further. Positive youth development, as summarized by Professor Richard Lerner of Tufts University, approaches youth as resources to be developed. This perspective embeds youth in communities and economies. To quote a systematic review from Youth Power, positive youth development centers on building skills, fostering healthy relationships, and supporting youth to be active partners in development efforts. It suggests that if young people have the knowledge, skills, and support they need, they will thrive as adults, enjoy good health, succeed economically, and make meaningful contributions to their communities. The principles of the framework have been variously articulated, but commonly share the intention of building up 4 or 5 features in young people, sometimes summed up as the 5 C's: competence, confidence, character, connection, caring. In recent years, these have been supplemented by another C, contribution, as into one's community. However, returning to our topic, generally speaking, all of these frameworks still assume that risk-taking is necessarily negative. Both models are framed in terms of risks as negative rather than risk as a neutral quality based on uncertainty. The trajectory is still from behavior to outcome, with risk-taking and assets the opposing forces that push their trajectory from good to bad outcome. Interrupting risk or bolstering assets will change the trajectory. Now let's put that aside for a moment and talk a bit about brain biology. The adolescent brain has reached its full adult size and contains more gray matter, neuronal cell bodies, than the adult brain. However, it contains less white matter, the synaptic tissue that connects the areas of gray matter together, connects the functional pieces of the brain. The adolescent years are a hectic period of reorganization in the brain. growing new white matter, pruning and restructuring connections between different brain areas. The accumulation of white matter over adolescence progresses from the back of the brain to the front. The limbic system is found at the back of the brain, lizard brain, they sometimes call it, and is the seat of emotional motivation. The front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is the seat of cognitive motivation. The limbic system is essential to sensation seeking and reward processing. Sensation seeking is the desire for new experiences that are thrilling, exciting, or if you prefer, autonomically arousing. There's a spectrum of sensation seeking. I'm on the end that likes quiet and predictability. My friend Elizabeth is on the end that likes leaving normally functioning aircraft while they're still above the cloud deck. She lives to leap out of airplanes with a parachute, mostly. When we consider reward processing, there's individual difference in how people detect, respond to, and seek out positive stimulus, the things they find pleasurable. Reward processing is central to learning and to goal-directed behavior. It's also central to addiction. The prefrontal cortex, in contrast, is central to executive function, particularly self-control, self-regulation. Self-control is the ability to inhibit behavioral impulses and thoughts, and reciprocally, impulsivity is the inability to inhibit those impulses. Impulsivity is about taking action without much conscious thought or planning. Impulsivity isn't necessarily associated with sensation seeking. One of the reasons I like a lot of routine and don't like to throw myself out of airplanes is that I'm less likely to be startled into doing something thoughtless. Because I'm a more impulsive person, I tend to damp down my sensation seeking. I once jumped down onto the subway tracks to pick up something I dropped without actually thinking about how I'd get back up, or how I'd avoid being hit by a train. I was a sober, well-rested, and fully grown adult. I'm just a little impulsive, and I acted before I thought. My friend Elizabeth would never. So to recap, the two systems in what we call the dual systems model are the limbic system, which controls reward processing and sensation seeking, and the prefrontal cortex, which includes the machinery that manages executive function, decision-making, learning, impulse control, self-regulation. In adolescence, the limbic system is fully developed, but the prefrontal cortex still has some cooking to do, and the connection between them takes some time to fully develop. So adolescents are, as a rule, inherently sensation-seeking. They're exquisitely attuned to reward, but they're still developing their impulse control and judgment. With practice and maturation, the healthy adolescent brain can switch back and forth between emotional motivation, based, as we said, in the limbic system, and cognitive motivation, based in the maturing prefrontal cortex, for decision-making, depending on goals. This flexibility enables the daring exploration and social interaction required for development, while still permitting thoughtful decisions. Development of this capacity is individually variable, and it depends on sex hormones, environment, and other influences we haven't necessarily fully identified yet. So to sum up, developmentally, adolescence is normally a time of exploring boundaries and seeking new experiences. Risk-taking behavior is a central feature of normal adolescent development. Adolescents have to pursue new experiences and learn by experimentation in order to achieve adult independence, and they have to engage deeply with peers and take social risks in order to develop adult social competence. But risk-taking also contributes to most morbidity and mortality in adolescents and young adults, including dangerous driving, substance use, interpersonal violence, sexually transmitted infections, and for girls, pregnancy and birth. Worldwide, alcohol and drug use are leading risk factors for disease burden in adolescents and young adults. And in Australia, tobacco use is the leading risk factor for lifetime disease burden. Globally, 70% of preventable deaths in adulthood are linked to long-standing patterns of health risk behavior originating in childhood and adolescence. In Australia, road crash is a leading cause of death in adolescents and young adults, with injury of all types accounting for 68% of years of life lost among males and 59% among females. But most adolescents mature unscathed, with the worst outcomes affecting only a few. And those few tend to experience multiple negative outcomes in multiple domains. This raises the questions: is there a way to identify the most vulnerable? And can we perhaps identify different patterns of risk-taking to target our interventions more usefully? We know that risk-taking tends to cluster in individuals, and in particular, that in young people, sexual and substance risk tend to co-occur. This coincides with clinical wisdom about vulnerable youth, but we don't know what other patterns hold or what the longitudinal development of these patterns is. So, Stream 2 of the WHY CRE is called Pathways and Costs. In that stream, we have 2 projects going on right now to try to answer some of these questions. The RAIN study was established in 1989 at Perth's King Edward Memorial Hospital for a randomized controlled trial of frequent ultrasound. 2,900 pregnant women were recruited from the maternity services at King Edward and most of the nearby private practices. So it's a snapshot, really, of almost all the pregnant women in Perth at that time. Data were collected at 18 weeks and again at 38 weeks, so close in the middle of the pregnancy, close to the end of the pregnancy, and again at birth. The 2,900 pregnancies resulted in 2,868 live births, with data collected for the whole cohort at that 18 and 38 weeks, and then about every other or third year since. The RAIN study has grown to be a multi-generational study, following not only this group of young now adults called Gen 2, but their children, Gen 3, their parents, Gen 1, and their grandparents, Gen 0. And before we leave this slide, I always sort of have to say, the RAIN study isn't an acronym and isn't named after raindrops. It's named after Mrs. Mary Rain, who's pictured here. She was a self-made hospitality and real estate mogul in Perth, and she established the RAIN Medical Research Foundation, which funded and continues to fund the RAIN study. I tip my hat to her. Without her, we wouldn't be here. So. RAIN is a rich resource with a broad array of data items collected about the original Gen 2 participants. Over 70,000 measurements in a variety of domains: sociodemographic, environmental, cardiometabolic, endocrine, psychological, and behavioral, collected from gestation to, as I said, young adulthood. They're almost age 30 now. This includes some risk-taking behavior, initiation of sexual behavior, substance use behavior, and driving, as well as a broad array of information to provide context, including housing and neighborhood details and schooling. And there's also considerable data about the individual and family to provide context. This is only the standardized instruments and measurements collected for these particular characteristics listed here. There's also extensive purpose-designed data collection and adapted items from other major, items adapted from other major Australian data collections like the National Secondary Students and Sexual Health Questionnaire and LSAC. So using these rich data, we actually intend to take a very close look at risk-taking in RAIN. This is the model we'll use to guide our analyses. We hypothesize that risk-taking patterns are determined in part by development of the capacity for self-control, which is set by early life environment and subsequently contextually modified by individual, family, school, and neighborhood variables. We also think that clusters of risk behaviors and risk behaviors that occur across multiple domains, like substance use, sexual health, driving risk, self-harm, form a pattern of negative risk-taking that's characteristic of a neurodevelopmental problem, and that it ends up in a range of poor health and social outcomes, again, clustered within vulnerable individuals. However, we also all know, an individual, or maybe more than one, adolescent who've managed to rise above the adverse circumstances of their early life, and early childhood, and have normative or even positive outcomes in adulthood. So we think that there's also a pattern of resilient risk-taking that carries people forward to normal or positive outcomes. And how do we propose to look at this? We'll use the Western Australian Data Linkage System, or WADLS as it's fondly known, to link a range of Western Australian government data sets with hard outcomes to the RAIN cohort. We'll relate those outcomes to patterns of risk we'll identify in RAIN, and then we'll look at predictors and mediators of these pathways through time. My colleagues at Macquarie University, Deborah Schofield and Petra Graham, will measure health economic outcomes to calculate the cost to society and the impact to early intervention. These are some of the outcomes we're examining and the databases from which they'll be gleaned. As you can see, these data will provide extensive information about outcomes like sexually transmitted infection, teenage pregnancy, self-harm and suicide, road-related injury, road crashes, other injury, educational attainment, and justice system encounters. But you may find yourself wondering how this moves us away from a deficit model. Well, when I started thinking about what constitutes positive risk, because I have throughout this been framing this in terms of negative risk, I realized that the way we commonly think of risk is in terms of the potential for reward versus the potential for harm. Dr. Natasha Duell of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Professor Lawrence Steinberg of Temple University have been thinking, it turns out, along the same lines. And their definition is that a risky act is a behavior for which the likelihood of its outcome, good or bad, is uncertain, with high-risk behaviors evincing greater variability in and uncertainty about the outcomes. It's very reminiscent of that ISO 31000 definition. These definitions are value neutral with respect to outcome and to the pathway by which we reach the outcome. The uncertainty requires a decision and an evaluation of the likelihood of different outcomes, positive and negative. Whether the decision-making is based in cognition or emotion, we entertain that prospect of benefit. The risk is defined by the range of potential outcomes. And in reviewing the literature about positive and negative risk-taking, Duell and Steinberg identified three major characteristics that differentiate the two kinds of risk. Positive risk-taking, they noted, carries benefit to the individual well-being, carries only mild potential costs, and is socially acceptable and legal. So when we think about this lower right corner of the model I showed you a few minutes ago, we're not actually doing great justice to those possibilities. I wonder if we can maybe do better to characterize these outcomes. Is there more nuance? How can we define adult success? We certainly have informal definitions already. It's how we guide our planning, whether we're parenting or teaching or devising policy. But there's surprisingly little empirical data out there. Investigators of the US-based Search Institute have recognized this gap and developed consensus dimensions of successful young adulthood. Shown here, you'll note that they're even broader than our categories of normative outcomes, if considerably more positively oriented. But there's considerable work remaining to bridge the gap between recognizing these dimensions and measuring them. So we intend to use existing Australian data to take the next steps. A conceptual audit and data analysis. The Murdoch Children's Research Institute Life Course Initiative brings together around 30 longitudinal studies, including over 20 population-based studies involving over 40,000 participants. We plan first to undertake a conceptual audit across the cohorts of the Life Course platform, and in the RAIN study, we will index key variables corresponding to the development of core competencies, capacities, and strengths, defining a successful and positive transition to young adulthood, identifying questionnaire items reflecting indicators of successful adulthood and of positive risk-taking. We'll also undertake parallel in-cohort data analyses to relate the range of risk-taking behaviors to the range of outcomes. to assess validity and robustness of the variables to represent those intended indicators. We'll also measure associations between risk-taking behavior, positive and negative, and indicators of success, and the contextual determinants that modify those associations. So, to sum up, this has been essentially a little spiel about backgrounds and methods without any actual data to share with you. And our fond hope is that we will be able soon to provide you with a more complete model of risk-taking behavior and objectively measured indicators of the consensus dimensions of successful adulthood. With a more nuanced and complete model that allows for risk-taking as a strength as well as a deficit, we can more accurately describe the transition to adulthood. Those data can be used in turn to inform interventions to nurture positive risk-taking and to empower young people, and to set up health economics evaluations that will help us get a whole picture of the costs and benefits of investing in the teenage decade. So, of course, this work doesn't exist in a vacuum, and obviously it would be impossible without the RAIN study participants, their families, the RAIN study team. I neglected to actually put the participants in the various life course cohorts on here, but I should have. And I thank my RAIN project collaborators as well, and my MCRI collaborators, some of whom are also RAIN project collaborators. And of course, I wouldn't be here without the NHMRC or MCRI. So, and having sort of bowled through this, I think that I'll stop sharing my screen and give you a chance to think and ask questions and share thoughts with me, please.
Thanks so much, Jen. That was really great. Gave us a really detailed overview of understanding risk, which we often just kind of use that term very, like a throwaway line, risk, when we talk about adolescence without realising, that it's actually quite a complex concept and very important for adolescents. So we do have a few questions that have come up. So Sharon's asked, thanks, Jen, for a fantastic presentation, a new way of thinking. So how will you capture the outcomes, positive or negative? So I suppose I know you've talked a little bit about it, looking at the longitudinal cohort resource through MCRI to try to identify those. But what about in the RAIN cohort? What sort of scope do we have in that data linkage data set?
Well, we have, and I would show you the slide again, but I'm afraid that I don't know, get us all hit by lightning if I continue to play with the settings. But we're linking to probably more data sets than any cohort has been linked to in Western Australia. And the range of outcomes is from the justice data, we'll get justice contacts, including arrests, incarcerations, community warnings. From the hospitalization data, obviously, we'll be able to get injury and we'll be linking to cause of death data as well. So for those very few participants who unfortunately passed away, we'll be able to determine why. And that will, so we'll be kind of getting the whole range of outcomes from adverse health events to social harms, because for some of these data sets, we'll be linking, for all that we're interested in the outcomes in adulthood, we'll be linking through the whole, for some of these, through the whole life, the whole life course to date, because we're interested in hospitalizations the whole way through. Obviously, if somebody has a chronic illness, we need to think about that. If it's emerging in childhood, we need to think about that differently than we do someone whose chronic illness has just begun to emerge in adulthood. And likewise, somebody who has complications of a serious injury in, an infancy is different from somebody who's just had a car wreck because they're, because of reckless driving. So we've got a range of those negative outcomes. Those are the easy ones to talk about because we're all accustomed to that. But the other consideration is those positive outcomes. And those are, I think I'm going to have to go to the life course data and to the data collection first and really give it a good think. Obviously, my thinking will be guided by the Search Institute and other sort of consensus perspectives on this. But at some level, we're going to be working within these same domains, and we're going to be saying things like, okay, if they're students, did they not just progress to university, but did they excel at university? And we have some of that information is present in their TISC scores and their tertiary institution, the scores and the standardized tests that are available to us. It gets trickier when it comes to things like employment, but we do have data about whether people like their jobs and are enjoying their jobs. So, which I think is actually a fairly important and often overlooked dimension, especially in sort of neoliberal culture, that that full employment ain't all there is to it. Satisfying employment is important as well. There are limitations. We don't know whether this person's true joy in life is going off and weaving baskets in the wilderness or playing video games competitively. We don't have that information, but in the longer term, that's I'd like to expand the thinking about this to include kind of more outcomes and more possibilities. So,
yeah, thanks, Jen. That was great. I think there's likely to be useful information that we can derive from the RAIN data. So there's a few other questions. One was from Lena Sanchi about who's interested in health service usage. And so will we be able to link to Medicare to get that?
Unfortunately,
young people?
Not on the current set of grants, because there was a difficulty with the consenting, actually. Medicare requires, for access to identified data, which is completely understandable, Medicare requires explicit consent for the use of those data. And when RAIN participants they consented to use of public databases, but they weren't explicitly asked, do you agree to have us access your Medicare and pharmacy benefit schemes data? So when we're going forward, we're going to, the next time the cohort is accessed, we'll be asking them to consent to that. Again, contingent on funding to access it, because but we are planning on looking at utilization. We do also have self-report of utilization for every follow-up, so we'll be looking at that.
Great, and so we've got some more questions. Fiona Robards, who's I know is working on a program to around raising awareness and addressing increasing use of e-cigarettes through the New South Wales Ministry of Health. She's asking about what are the implications of some of the that background information you presented for strength-based messaging around risk behaviours, like for e-cigarette use, which there has been like a massive take up of e-cigarettes in just the recent year or so in Australia in this age group.
Yeah, which is, if it's happening with those who wouldn't otherwise have gone on to smoke, is a difficulty, isn't it? And if it's perceived as healthier, that's not necessarily a positive either, is it? I have to admit, I've never thought about that. And so I don't have an answer about strengths-based messaging. And Rachel, feel free to jump in if you do. Rachel's been my close collaborator on all this work, so for all I'm presenting, I mean, I'm always happy to handball a couple of these questions to her if she's better equipped. What do you think?
Well, I think that's it's clear that we need to look at all of the evidence around the effectiveness of looking at strength-based interventions and strength-based communication messaging. And so one of the things that we had planned to do is actually look at systematically at the evidence for effective interventions, and clearly we would be looking at strength-based interventions as well as other types of interventions. So, and I mean, I think that there's a lot of scope for that, and so Fiona, we are very keen to look at that and see whether or not there is evidence that they make more of a difference. I know things like legislation and the more structural interventions tend to be, highly effective, but it's whether these other interventions are also effective. We probably don't have as much evidence for that yet. So we have a question from Aya about whether that all of the data is numerical. Is there any interview data which would provide
There's no
nuance? Yeah.
RAIN doesn't have any interview data. I haven't started the scoping review of life course yet, the scoping audit of the life course. But I don't think that's I don't think there's probably a lot, if there is any, which does not preclude. I think there's an enormous space here, and I've spent a fair amount of time mentally twiddling with how we can actually get firsthand information about how people think about risk. Never mind the experimental psychology piece, but how do people think that they think about risk? But it's a tricky business to try to propose it to people, because I don't know about you, but I didn't consciously start thinking this through until I was doing this work. I mean, I think it's part of the sensation-seeking part and the impulsivity part, right? Is that you kind of don't think about how you take risks until you've taken them. And then maybe you think of it in terms of the outcome rather than thinking of it in terms of why or how you made the decision. But I think it's incredibly valuable and incredibly important to sort that out. I just don't know how we best ask the question. And particularly when you're dealing with adolescents, you need to be very skilled in how you ask questions, because they do a lot of things that they haven't necessarily articulated why they're doing until after the fact. So I think you have to have a very skilled interviewer, and you have to put some really serious thought into how you frame the questions. But gosh, I would be happy. I mean, and if it turns out I'm wrong, if somebody does have interview data about this, please come tell me. I'd be excited to know about it. So,
Kate Steinbeck, hi Jen, great presentation. We really need these important studies in order to shift the stereotype of adolescents being big risks to themselves and others. How can we start to change the conversation?
I mean, I'm trying, and I'm happy to go out there and continue to say, well, let's not think of it entirely in negative terms. As academics, we have all these options like publishing articles in the conversation, doing outreach and translation, but there's also sort of thinking about it as starting at home, right? Everyone who has teenagers kicking around the house, talking to them about how they think about it, and thinking about, I know that all parents of adolescents pretty much think about all the time is, how am I parenting, and am I actually destroying my child in some way? So, turning that worry to something constructive, like a conversation with your kids, seems like a good place to start. And with all of the tremendous connections between WH&Y and education and the Center for Adolescent Health at MCRI and education, I think there's lots of ways there to touch the lives of young people and say, we respect you and we respect your decision making more than maybe the discourse suggests. Can you talk to me about how you want to do this? I think the WH&Y Youth Commission is probably also a really great place to start. So those are some thoughts. But again, anybody who has anything, come to me and I'm happy to hear it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and that's really good to mention the Youth Commission, because they do play a really important role in helping us translate the sorts of findings that we have out into the world of young people. And
actually, this past weekend we met with we did a research methods speed dating. Philippa Collin set up for us and her crew with the WH&Y Youth Commission, and one of the commissioners pointed out to me that our model is very linear. It doesn't take into account the fact that behaviors and outcomes feed back into decision making. And that was real significant food for thought for me. And I think, the insights, and they all raised, every one of the group pretty much raised either the word intersectionality or the concept of intersectionality, and the notion that we need to be very aware of the fact that that disadvantage and advantage are multi-axial and intersect, and that we need to undertake these analyses with acute awareness of context. And I thought that was a really useful insight.
Yeah, we didn't imagine how interested and of value they would be to a birth cohort, but it was wonderful to get their input. So Annabelle Hobbs says, thanks, Jen. I was just interested in the concept of positive risk-taking being if the bad outcomes are deemed mild, considering the differences in how people perceive the severity of outcomes. Did the authors comment on any examples of positive risk-taking that are beneficial in adolescence?
Yes, and there's even a couple of instruments at this point to try to measure, and they're all sort of influenced. They're all sort of influenced by the perceptions of the people designing them, as all instruments are. Sorry, but I'm trying to say that that they're not coming out of a sort of standard instrument validation concept. But to actually answer the question, some examples are performance, like on stage, social risk. Did you, if you're in a group, some of the items that are asked are things like, if you're in a group of your friends and someone says something or does something that you're very uncomfortable with, do you say anything? Or do you do anything? Do you, if imagine that you were trying out for a play, would you do that? So they're trying to frame it in terms of the potential outcome is, all that happens if you try out for a play and you don't succeed is you're embarrassed. That's, you haven't broken the law. You're not going to go to prison. You're not going to break your leg. So the risks, the potential cost is actually fairly low. But in the adolescent context, embarrassment is actually a pretty high cost. So you have to consider this stuff from the perspective. But in addition to that, there's sports, there's physical risk-taking. And again, we're not necessarily talking about climbing on a fence or climbing up on the roof. We're talking about, do you try out for a sports team? So there are a lot of examples that are being used, but we're still in the very early days of thinking about it. And it's not, there's no consistent consensus about what it really is.
Great. So another really important question, which also came up on Saturday with our youth commission, and it's about the diversity within the cohort, and particularly the question is whether what proportion of participants identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And we also had the question from our youth commissioners about whether the cohort itself, that clearly from that picture it looks very dated, when they were born in Perth, and so what implications, and they're all the same individuals that have been followed through time. So what are the implications of the specific cohort that we're looking at compared to Australia today? Young people today are likely to be quite different. So,
and yes, and succinctly, yes, 1989 Perth, not a hotbed of diversity, and for all that 1989 Perth did have a fairly substantial Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, that doesn't mean that they were necessarily captured in the birth cohort. So there's definitely, it's definitely Indigenous people are underrepresented in the cohort. And one of the plans that I didn't talk about is to go on and develop this work in both the growing up in Australia, longitudinal study of Australian children, and the longitudinal study of Indigenous children, and certain other cohorts to which we have access that will provide we're hoping, a different and more diverse perspective. but we got to start somewhere, and this is the cohort that we've got the most experience with. So, but we're very much aware that this is all going to be extremely culturally bound.
Yeah, and we have one. I think might be the final question. Great presentation from Corinne Kayol. Great presentation with a lot to think about. There is, but there is a lot of peer learning and self-learning through social media amongst adolescents that it goes on. Could this be used to engage adolescents in the discussion? Using adolescent leaders, for example, leading these conversations, designing media, perhaps for interventions.
That's really brilliant.
I'm not sure.
And for things like taking it to the conversation, I think that's actually a really solid idea. I'm mindful of the fact that some of the most effective communication around the experience of being a trans young person has been coming from trans young people themselves in Australia, and I think that's a really good model for how we can engage, because some of these young folks I've met at conferences, I've seen their work in the conversation, I've seen them on, I've seen them on the TV. I've seen them on the TV on shows that are not on public broadcasting. And so I know that there's that anything I can say 50 times as a middle-aged academic would be much more effectively communicated to both adolescents and their parents by an adolescent, by an articulate, smart, well-briefed, thoughtful adolescent. And so I think that's a really valid observation, and we do have folks in WH&Y who are co-designing work and who are developing work that way, and I hope that I can learn from them and we can do the translation that way. So, yeah,
and we also have ourselves conducted a study on social media and how that influences young people's perceptions around sexual activity, sexual behaviours, and relationships, and how it can support agency in young people of very diverse sexualities and genders as well. So we are doing separate work, but it's the RAIN cohort doesn't lend itself very well to this type of work, because we've basically got what we have, and so they're all for different purposes, but we can cross-fertilise our different research projects with the learnings that we take away from the various things that we do. And that's the beauty of WH&Y, because we have such an interdisciplinary group of researchers, social science researchers, and health literacy researchers, population health and epidemiology researchers, and young people, of course, and clinician researchers. So it's really ideally we can draw on all of our strengths to try to answer what are complex and complicated questions around youth health. So anyway, thank you to everybody for your attendance and your participation, and thanks, Jen, for a wonderful presentation. You did really well.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I think the question session alone was worth the price of admission. So grateful to all of you for sharing your thoughts, and I really appreciate you being here. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
See you all next time.
See you next time.